Hello, I'm going to be reading Chapter 10 of the Bantam Classics Abridged version of the Count of Monte Cristo. The vocabulary. Machiavelli was an Italian author and philosopher who explored government and control. Principalities are small governments that make up a country. I'm not actually sure how this is pronounced. I'm going to say hake, and this is a type of fish. Laborious means requiring labor or work. Hearthstone is a stone forming the base of a fireplace. Finis is the Latin word for the end. Ingenious means requiring genius or requiring intelligence, very smart for a person to have done. And sublime is too beautiful, too wonderful to put into words. Things you need to know before reading are that education would not have been afforded to Edmond Dantès considering his class. He was a sailor. His father is poor. So chances are he was not very well off. And so education was not something you automatically got. So he may have been able to read and write, but that was probably about it. Abbé means father, so Abbé Faria is a priest, and he would have been very well formally educated. Catalepsy is similar to epilepsy and causes paralysis. It is a death sentence if you had these, especially at this time. So here we go. Chapter 10. Dantès threw his arms around his new friend, for whom he had waited so long and impatiently, and drew him over to the window so that he could see him as clearly as possible in the dim light which entered the cell. He was a rather short man, whose hair had turned white, more from suffering than from age. His piercing eyes were almost hidden under thick gray eyebrows. His beard, which was still black, hung down to his chest. His thin face, furrowed with deep lines, was that of a man more accustomed to exercising his mental faculties than his physical strength. As for his clothes, it was impossible to distinguish their original form, for they were in tatters. He appeared to be at least 65 years old, but a certain vigor in his movements suggested that part of his apparent age might be due to his long captivity. He received Dante's exuberant outbursts with pleasure. For a moment, his icy soul seemed to melt in the presence of this ardent young man. He responded to him with a certain warmth, despite his bitter disappointment at finding himself in another cell when he had expected to find freedom instead. "First of all," he said, "let's see if it's possible to conceal the opening from your jailer." He pushed the stone back into its hole. "This stone was removed quite carelessly," he remarked. "Didn't you have any tools?" "Do you?" asked Dantès in amazement. "I made some for myself. Except for a file, I have everything I need: a chisel, pincers, and a crowbar." And he showed him a strong, sharp blade with a wooden handle. "How did you make that?" "From one of the clamps of my bed. It was with this tool that I dug the whole passage from my cell to yours, a distance of about 50 feet. 50 feet? Cried Dantès with a sort of terror. "Yes, but all my work was in vain. The corridor in front of your cell leads to a courtyard full of guards. From here there is no way to escape, but God's will be done." The old man's face took on an expression of profound resignation. With a mixture of amazement and admiration, Dantès looked at this man who could thus renounce so philosophically a hope which had sustained him for so long. "Now will you tell me who you are?" asked Dantès. "Yes, if that still interests you, now that I am unable to be of any use to you. I'm Abbé Faria. I've been in the Château d'If since 1811, but before that I was imprisoned in the fortress of Fenestrella for 3 years. In 1811, I was transferred from Piedmont to France." "But why were you imprisoned?" "Because in 1807 I dreamed of the project which Napoleon tried to carry out in 1811, because, like Machiavelli, instead of all the principalities which made Italy a nest of weak, tyrannical little kingdoms, I wanted to see a single great empire, because I had thought I found my Caesar Borgia in a crowned fool who pretended to understand my views in order to betray me." Dantès did not understand how a man could risk his life for such things. "Aren't you—" he asked, beginning to share his jailer's opinion. That priest who believes everyone to be ill? You mean mad, don't you? I didn't dare say it, said Dante, smiling. Yes, said Faria with a bitter laugh. I'm the one they think is mad. Dante stood silent for a moment, then said, Have you given up the idea of escape? I now see that escape is impossible. It would be rebelling against God to attempt something which is against his wishes. Why lose hope? Wouldn't it be asking too much of Providence to expect to succeed the first time? Why not dig another passage in another direction? Another passage? Do you know what I've already done? Do you know that it took me 4 years to make my tools? Do you know that for 2 years I scratched and scraped earth as hard as granite? Do you know that I had to dislodge stones which would never have thought myself capable of even moving? Do you know that in order to find a place to deposit all these stones and all that earth, that I had to pierce the wall of a staircase, and that staircase is now so full I have no place to put even a handful of dust? Finally, do you know that I thought myself to be almost at the end of my labor and felt that I had just enough strength left to finish it when I suddenly learned that all had been in vain? Oh no, I'll do nothing more to reconquer my freedom, since it's God's will that I be lost forever. Dantes bowed his head in order to not let the priest see that his joy at having found a companion prevented him from sympathizing fully with his sorrow. In my 12 years in prison, continued Faria, I've carefully thought over all the famous escapes in history. Successful escapes are extremely rare, and most of them have been thought out in great detail and patiently prepared. Still, some of them have been due to chance, and those are the best. From now on, we'll wait for an opportunity, and if it comes, we'll take advantage of it. You were able to wait, said Dante, sighing. Your long labor gave you constant occupation, and when you didn't have your work to distract you, you had your hopes to console you. That hasn't been my only occupation, said the priest. What else do you do? I write and study. Do they give you paper, pens, and ink? No, but I make my own. You make your own paper, pens, and ink, cried Dantes. Yes. Dantes looked at him in admiration, but it was difficult to believe what he said. Faria sensed his doubt and said, When you come to my cell, I'll show you an entire book, the result of all the thoughts, research, and study of my whole life. It's a treatise on the possibility of a general monarchy in Italy. And you wrote it here? Yes, on 2 shirts. I've invented a preparation which makes it cloth as smooth and solid as parchment, and I make excellent pens from the cartilage of the heads of those enormous hake they sometimes serve us. What about ink? Asked Dantes. How do you make that? There was once a fireplace in my cell, said Faria. It was closed up some time before I arrived, but it was apparently used for many years because the inside of it is covered in a thick layer of soot. I dissolve some of that soot in some of the wine they give me every Sunday, and it makes good ink. When I wish to call special attention to a certain passage, I prick one of my fingers and write my own blood. And when can I see all that? Asked Dantes. Whenever you like, replied Faria. Oh, right away. Follow me then, said the priest. And he turned and disappeared into the underground passage. Dantes followed him. After passing through the underground corridor, bending down without difficulty, Dantes arrived at the opposite end, which opened into the priest's cell. The floor of the cell was paved. It was by lifting one of the flagstones in the darkest corner of it that the priest had begun the laborious undertaking of which Dantes had seen the end. As soon as he entered the cell, the young man examined it carefully, but at first sight its appearance presented nothing extraordinary. I'm very anxious to see your treasures, he said to the priest. Faria went over to the fireplace and removed the stone which had formerly been the hearthstone, revealing a rather deep cavity. Here were hidden the objects of which he had spoken to Dantes. What would you like to see first? He asked. Show me your work on the monarchy of Italy. Faria pulled out 3 or 4 rolls of cloth composed of strips of about 4 inches wide and 18 inches long, all numbered and covered with writing. The writing was Italian, which Dantes, being a Provençal, understood entirely. It's all here, said Faria. It was only a week ago that I wrote Finis at the bottom of the 78th strip. 2 of my shirts and all of my handkerchiefs went into it. If I ever regain my freedom, and if there's a publisher in Italy with the courage to print it, my reputation is made. He showed Dantes the pens he had made. The young man looked around for instrument with which he had been able to cut them so precisely. "You're wondering where the knife is, aren't you?" said Faria. "Here it is. It is my masterpiece, made from an old iron candlestick. It was as sharp as a razor. And I've made myself a lamp so that I can carry on my work at night," continued Faria. "How did you make it?" "I separate the fat from the meat they bring me. I melt it, and it gives me a sort of thick oil." He showed Dantès his lamp. "But what do you do for matches?" asked Dantès. "I pretended to have a skin disease. I asked for some sulfur, and they gave it to me." Dantès set the objects down on the table and bowed his head, overwhelmed by the power and perseverance of the priest's mind. "That's not all," said Faria. "It wouldn't be wise to keep all my treasures in one hiding place. Let's close this one." They put the stone back in place. The priest sprinkled dust over it and smoothed it out with his foot, then went over to the bed and pulled it back. Behind it, covered by a perfectly fitting stone, was a hole in which there was a rope ladder 25 to 30 feet long. Dantès examined it and found it to be amazingly strong. "How did you get the rope for this wonderful piece of work?" he asked. "First, from several shirts that I had. Then from unraveling my sheets during the 3 years I was imprisoned at Fenestrella. I managed to take the thread with me when I was transferred to the Château d'If, and I continued working on the ladder here." "But didn't your jailers notice that your sheets had no hems?" "I sewed them up again with this needle." He showed Dantès a fishbone, long, sharp, and still threaded. "At first, I thought of removing the bars and escaping through the window." He went on. "As you can see, this window is a little wider than the one in your cell. I would have widened it a little more when I was ready to escape, but this window opens onto an inside courtyard, so I finally abandoned the plan as too risky. But I've kept the rope ladder in case some unexpected opportunity should present itself." As he seemed to be examining the ladder, Dantès was thinking of something else. An idea had just entered his mind. This man, so intelligent, so ingenious, so profound, might be able to see clearly into the dark mystery of his own misfortune, which he himself had never been able to fathom. "What are you thinking about?" asked Faria, smiling. "I was thinking that you've told me about your life, but that you know nothing about mine." "Your life, young man, has been too short to contain anything of great importance." "It contains an immense misfortune, at least," said Dantès. "A misfortune which I didn't deserve, and I wish I could blame men for it instead of blaspheming against God, as I've sometimes done." "Tell me your story, then," said the priest, closing his hiding place and pushing his bed back in place. Dantès told him what he called the story of his life, which was limited to a voyage to India and 2 or 3 voyages to the Near East. Finally, he came to his last voyage and told of the death of Captain Leclerc, the package the latter gave to him to deliver to the Isle of Elba, the letter which the marshal there gave him to deliver to Monsieur Noirtier in Paris, then his arrival in Marseille, his visit to his father, his love for Mercédès, the betrothal feast, his arrest, his questioning, his temporary imprisonment in the Palace of Justice, and finally his transfer to the Château d'If. From then on, Dantès knew nothing more, not even how long he had been a prisoner. When he had finished, Faria remained silent, lost in thought. After a time, he said, "There is a maxim of jurisprudence which says, if you wish to discover the guilty person, first find out to whom the crime might be useful. To whom might your disappearance be useful?" "To no one," cried Dantès. "I wasn't important enough." "Don't say that. Everything is relative. You were about to be made captain of the Pharaon, weren't you?" "Yes." "And you were about to marry a beautiful young girl?" "Yes." "Now, first of all, was it to anyone's interest that you should not become captain of the Pharaon?" "No, the crew all liked me. In fact, they've been able to elect their own captain. I'm sure they would have elected me. There was only one man on board who had any reason to dislike me. I once had a quarrel with him and proposed to settle it by a duel, which he refused to do." "Aha! What's that man's name?" "Danglars. He was the purser." "If you had to become captain, would you have kept him on the ship?" "Not if I had the choice. I thought I noticed some inaccuracies in his accounts." "Good. Now, was anyone present during your last conversation with Captain Leclerc?" "No, we were alone." "Could anyone have overheard you?" "I suppose so. The door was open. In fact, wait a minute. Yes, Danglars passed by just as Captain Leclerc gave me the package." "Good," said the priest. "We're on the right track. Did you take anyone ashore with you when you landed at the Isle of Elba?" "No one." "What did you do with the letter you received there?" "In my portfolio." "Did you have your portfolio with you?" "No, it was on the ship. I didn't put the letter into the portfolio until I was back on board. What did you do with it between the time you left the island and the time you put it in the portfolio? I carried it in my hand. Therefore, when you came back on board, everyone could see that you were carrying a letter. Is that right? Yes. Including Danglars? Yes. Now, said Faria, listen to me and try to remember everything as clearly as you can. Can you tell me how the denunciation was worded? Oh, yes. I read it 3 times, and every word is engraved on my memory. And he repeated the anonymous letter, word for word. The priest shrugged his shoulders. It's as clear as daylight, he said. You must have had a very innocent heart not to have guessed it immediately. What kind of handwriting did Danglars have? He wrote a good round hand. How was the anonymous letter written? With a backward slant. Faria smiled and said, the handwriting was disguised, wasn't it? It was too bold for that. Wait, said Faria. He took one of his pens and wrote a few lines with his left hand on a piece of specially prepared cloth. Dantès shrank back and looked at him almost in terror. It's amazing, he exclaimed. How much that other writing looked like this. That means the denunciation was written with the left hand. I've observed that almost all handwritings done with the left hand are similar. Now let's proceed to the second question. Was it to anyone's interest that you should not marry Mercedes? Yes, there was a young man who loved her, a Catalan named Fernand. Do you think he was capable of writing the letter? No, although he was quite capable of stabbing me. Besides, he didn't know any of the things that were in the letter. I didn't tell anyone about it, not even Mercedes. Did Fernand know Danglars? No. Yes. I remember now. I saw them sitting together in the arbor of a tavern 2 days before my marriage was to take place. Danglars was friendly and mocking. Fernand was pale and agitated. They were with a tailor named Caderousse, whom I knew very well, but he was dead drunk. What we've deduced about your 2 friends so far has been child's play, said Faria. But now I want you to give me some very precise details. Question me then, for you seem to see my life more clearly than I do myself. Who examined you after your arrest? The deputy public prosecutor. How did he treat you? Very kindly. Did you tell him everything? Yes. Did his attitude change at any time during the examination? Yes. When he read the letter I received on the Isle of Elba, he seemed to be greatly upset by misfortune. Are you sure it was your misfortune that upset him? Well, he gave me one great proof of his sympathy. He burned the letter before my eyes and said that was the only evidence against you, and as you see, I've destroyed it. That action was too sublime to be natural. Do you think so? I'm sure of it. To whom was the letter addressed? To Monsieur Noirtier, 13 Rue Coheron, Paris. Do you think it's possible that the deputy may have had some reason for wanting that letter to disappear? Perhaps. He made me promise 2 or 3 times in my own interest, he said, not to speak about the letter to anyone, and he made me swear never to utter the name of the man to whom it was addressed. Noirtier, repeated Faria thoughtfully. I once knew a Noirtier at the court of the Queen of Etruria, a Noirtier who had been a Girondin during the Revolution. What was the name of the deputy who prosecuted you? Villefort. Faria burst out laughing. Poor young man, he exclaimed. That deputy was kind to you. Yes, he burned the letter before your eyes and made you swear never to utter the name of Noirtier. Yes. Do you know who Monsieur Noirtier was? He was the deputy's father. His father! His father! Cried Dantès, standing up and clutching his head between his hands as though to prevent it from bursting. Yes, his father, whose name is Noirtier de Villefort. A dazzling light seemed to flash through Dantès' brain, and things which had until then remained dark and obscure now became crystal clear to him. Villefort's change of attitude during the examination, the letter he had destroyed, the oath he had demanded, his almost supplicating voice, which instead of threatening seemed to be imploring, all this came back to Dantès' memory at once. He uttered a cry and reeled like a drunken man for a moment. Then he rushed into the passage leading back to his own cell, crying out as he left, "Oh, I must be alone to think all over this." Back in his cell, he fell onto his bed where the jailer found him that evening, his eyes staring into space, his features drawn, motionless, and mute as a statue. During those hours of meditation which flowed by like seconds, he he formed a terrible resolution and swore a fearful oath. At length, a voice roused him from his reverie. It was Faria inviting him to have supper with him. Dantès followed him. The stiff, determined expression of his face indicated that he had taken a resolution. Faria looked at him steadfastly and said, "I regret having helped you clarify your past and having told you what I did." "Why?" "Because I've instilled in your heart a feeling that wasn't there before. Vengeance." Dantès smiled. "Let's talk about something else," he said. The priest looked at him for a moment longer and shook his head sadly. Then, as Dantès had requested, he began to talk about something else. The old prisoner was one of those men whose conversation contains a vast amount of information and continuously holds the listener's interest. But it was not all self-centered. The unfortunate man never spoke of his own misfortune. Dantès listened to each word with admiration. "You must teach me a little of what you know," he said after a time, "even if only in order not to be bored with me. It seems to me now that you must prefer solitude to the company of a man as uneducated and limited as I am." "Alas, my boy," said Faria, smiling, "human knowledge is quite limited. When you've learned mathematics, physics, history, and the 3 or 4 living languages I speak, you'll know everything I do. It won't take more than 2 years to teach you all that." "2 years!" exclaimed Dantès. "Do you think I can learn all those things in 2 years?" "You won't learn to use all of them in that time, but you will learn their principles." That same evening, the 2 prisoners drew up a plan for Dantès' education and began to carry it out the next day. Dantès had a prodigious memory and a quick, keen intelligence. His mathematical turn of mind gave him a facility for all kinds of calculation, while the poetic strain which is in every sailor breathed life into demonstrations reduced to numbers and lines. He already knew Italian and a little modern Greek, which he had picked up on his voyages to the East. With the aid of these 2 languages, he soon understood the structure of all the others. Within 6 months, he was beginning to speak Spanish, English, and German. The days passed swiftly, but each one was so instructive that at the end of a year, he was a different man. As for Faria, Dantès noticed that, despite the distraction which his presence afforded him, he grew gloomier day by day. His mind seemed to be occupied with a single constant thought. He would fall into a deep reverie, sigh involuntarily, stand up suddenly, and begin pacing up and down his cell. One day, he stopped short in the midst of this pacing and cried out, "Oh, if only there was no sentry!" "Have you found a way to escape?" asked Dantès eagerly. "Yes, if the sentry were blind and deaf." "He'll be blind and deaf," said the young man in a tone of resolution which frightened the priest. "No," cried Faria, "I'll have no bloodshed." Dantès wanted to discuss the subject further, but Faria shook his head and refused to say anything more. 3 more months went by. "Are you strong?" asked Faria one day. Without answering, Dantès picked up the chisel, bent it double, and then straightened it out again. "Will you agree not to kill the sentry except as a last resource?" "Yes, I swear." "Then we can carry out our plan. How long will it take?" "At least a year. Here's my plan." Faria showed Dantès a drawing he had made. It was a plan of their 2 cells and the passage joining them. From the middle of this passage, they would excavate a tunnel which would lead them under the gallery where the sentry paced back and forth. There, they would loosen one of the flagstones with which the floor of the gallery was paved. This stone would give way under the weight of the soldier who would fall into the excavation below. Dantès would seize him, bind and gag him, and then the 2 prisoners would go through one of the windows of the gallery, climb down the hall with the aid of their rope ladder, and escape. Dantès clapped his hands and his eyes sparkled with joy. The plan was so simple that it was bound to succeed. He and Faria went to work that very day. For over a year they worked, during which time Faria continued to educate Dantès as the work went on. After 15 months, the excavation was finished, and they could hear the sentry walking back and forth above them. Now all they had to do was wait for a dark, moonless night. They prevented the flagstone from giving way prematurely by propping it up with a small wooden beam which they had found in the foundations. Dantès had just finished putting it in place when suddenly he heard Faria, who had remained behind in Dantès' cell, cry out in pain. He hurried back and found the priest in the middle of the floor. He was pale, his fists were clenched, and his forehead was streaming with perspiration. "Oh, my God!" cried Dantès. What's the matter? I'm lost, said Faria. Listen to me. A terrible illness, perhaps fatal, is about to seize me. I can feel it coming on. I had an attack of it the year before I was imprisoned. There's only one remedy for this illness. Run to my cell and lift up the foot of the bed, which is hollow. Inside, you'll find a small bottle full of a red liquid. Bring it to me. No, the jailer might see me here. Help me get back to my cell while I still have the strength. Without losing his head, Dantès carefully led Faria through the underground passage, and when they had reached Faria's cell, laid him down on his bed. Thank you, said the priest, shivering in every limb as though he had just come out of ice-cold water. The attack is coming. I'm going to have a cataleptic fit. I may not make a movement or utter a sound, but on the other hand, I may foam at the mouth, stiffen convulsively, and shriek. If I do, try not to let them hear me, because if they'd put me in another cell, we'd be separated forever. When you see me motionless, cold, and apparently dead, then and only then pry apart my teeth with the knife and pour 8 to 10 drops of this liquid into my mouth. Perhaps it will revive me. Perhaps, exclaimed Dantès in anguish. Help! Help! Cried Dantès. I'm dying! I'm dying! The attack was so sudden and so violent that he was unable to finish the word. His eyes dilated, his mouth became twisted, his cheeks turned purple, and he writhed, foamed, and shrieked. As Faria himself had instructed him to do, Dantès smothered his cries under the blanket. This phase of the attack lasted for 2 hours. Then he stiffened in one last convulsion and turned as cold, as pale, and as inert as marble. Dantès took the knife, carefully pried Faria's clenched teeth apart with it, counted out 10 drops of the red liquid, and waited. An hour went by, and still Faria did not make the slightest movement. Dantès stared at him, clutching his head between his hands. Finally, a faint touch of color appeared in his cheeks. His eyes, which had remained opened and staring, took on an expression of life. A weak sigh escaped from his lips, and he made a movement. Saved! Saved! Cried Dantès. Faria could not yet speak, but he stretched out his hand toward the door with visible anxiety. Dantès listened and heard the jailer's footsteps approaching. He jumped up, rushed over to the entrance of the passage, plunged into it, replaced the stone above his head, and returned to his own cell. The door opened a moment later, and the jailer found the prisoner sitting on his bed as usual. As soon as his footsteps had died away in the corridor, Dantès, without thinking of eating, hurried back to Faria's cell. The priest had regained consciousness, but he was still lying on his bed, helpless and inert. "Didn't think I'd see you again," he said. "Why not?" asked Dantès. "Did you think you were going to die?" "No, but everything is ready for your escape, and I expected you to leave." Dantès flushed with indignation. "Without you," he cried. "Did you think I was capable of that?" "I see now that I was mistaken. Oh, I'm so weak, so helpless." "Your strength will come back," said Dantès, sitting down on the bed beside Faria and taking his hands. Faria shook his head. "Last time," he said. "The attack lasted for half an hour, after which I was so hungry and got up unaided. This time, I'm unable to move either my right leg or right arm. The third attack will either kill me or leave me completely paralyzed." No, don't worry. You won't die. If you have a third attack, you'll be free by then. We'll save you the same way we saved you this time. Better than this time, in fact, because you'll have the best medical care obtainable." "My friend," said the old man, "don't deceive yourself. The attack I've just undergone has condemned me to a lifetime imprisonment. I'll never be able to swim again. This arm is paralyzed, not just for the moment, but forever. Believe me, I've been reflecting on this illness ever since I had my first attack of it. I was expecting it, for it runs in my family. My father died from the third attack of it, and so did my grandfather. The physician who gave me this medicine, and he was no other than the famous Cabanis, predicted the same fate for me." "He was mistaken," cried Dantès. "As for your paralysis, that doesn't bother me at all. I'll swim with you on my shoulders." "My boy," said Faria, "you're a sailor and a good swimmer, so I'm sure you know that a man weighted down with such a burden would be unable to swim more than 50 strokes. No, I'll stay here until the hour of my deliverance, which can now be nothing except the hour of my death. As for you, leave, escape. You're young, lithe, and strong. Don't worry about me." "Very well, then," said Dantès. "I'll stay too." He stood up, solemnly stretched out his hand over the old man, and said, "I swear by the blood of Christ that I will never leave you while you are still alive." Faria looked at the noble-hearted, straightforward young man and read the sincerity of his oath on his face. It was animated by an expression of the purest devotion. "So be it," said the old man. "I accept. Thank you." Then, taking his hand, he said, "Perhaps you'll be rewarded some day for your disinterested devotion. But now, since I cannot and you will not leave, you must fill in the tunnel under the gallery. The sentry may notice a hollow sound when he walks over it, which would lead to our discovery and separation. Go do it now. Take all night if necessary, but don't come back here until tomorrow morning after the jailer's visit. I'll have something important to tell you then." Dantès took Faria's hand, then left his friend with obedience and respect.